All right, today we're joined again by Paul Friels. Paul, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. How about you, John?
Doing well, thank you. So we got a comment from listener Chad. He said that the discussion with you was the best podcast episode to date. So what better way to follow that up than to bring you back?
I hope Chad enjoys this one too.
So in that episode that we last did, we were talking about a number of different things. And one thing that kind of came up in the conversation was working remotely, the fact that both of us work remotely, and also the idea of, oh my goodness, we should do a whole episode on that. In the meantime, I found an article somewhere on the Trello board, or the Trello.com site, their blog, the 10 biggest misconceptions about remote work. And I thought this might just be a nice, I don't know, an interesting backdrop to our discussion on remote work. What do you think?
I think that's great. Yeah, and I think the whole idea of remote work nowadays really gets saddled with a lot of issues that I think maybe come out of fear or misunderstanding, or just maybe just a trepidation about control.
Yeah, and you know what's funny about that? There was two. You also mentioned kind of the misnomers around it. There was also this other post in Medium, on Medium.com, and I thought there was the title of the article was "We are distributed." We are not, and the kind of the force of that article was, we're not remote. We're not in an office. We are distributed.
Right.
And I thought that was interesting. I'd never really thought of remote as being a negative term.
Right. Yeah, I hadn't really either. And I actually read that same article that you're talking about. I guess maybe the point that it was making is that, remote has some connotations of being, I don't know, hard to reach, distant, but not even necessarily in the geographic sense, but in the psychological or emotional sense. Mm-hmm. Whereas distributed really sounds powerful. In other words, wherever you go, there we are. Right.
That's a really nice way of framing it. I'll read off the 10 myths from this Trello article. We'll also include a link to the other article as well for anyone that's curious. And then maybe, I don't know, if there's a couple of these that jump out to you as like, yeah, let's dig into that one. We'll go for it.
Yeah, actually, John, maybe before we do that, one of the questions maybe our audience might be asking is, why you and me? Like, why are we talking about being remote? How did you end up being remote or distributed, I guess, at your Can you be distributed? You're distributed like if you lay, maybe if you lay across the threshold from one room to another, you're distributed.
Yeah, that's I think funny. Yeah, how did you
one of us may not be.
How did you become distributed? Well, it's kind of a funny story. So to make a very long story short, I was living in Massachusetts with my wife, and I had worked at EMC, and then I had taken a job at Red Hat. And I had been at Red Hat for a couple years, and we were thinking about having a family, and we got some really good advice that said if you're going to have family, it's really good to be closer to other family. My family some of my family had kind of located to Portland, Oregon, as well as my wife's really good friend. After some hard back and forth discussions, we made the decision, okay, if we're going to do this, got to do it. And if we're going to move, we're going to do it now, or we probably won't move. And so we made a very bold decision in hindsight that turned out pretty well. Basically, I went to my boss at the time. He's not with Red Hat anymore, but I went to him and said, okay, I'm moving and we're putting our house on the market, and I'd love to stay with Red Hat if I can. And if I can't, I totally understand. And he said, oh no, you can't do quite what you're doing now, but there's this other role that'd be perfect for you. Will you take on this other role? And I said, yep, sure, glad to do that. And so I've been with Red Hat 12 plus years. So 2 of those were in an office. The last 10 have been remote here from Portland, Oregon.
Wow. So you've really been, doing it for quite a while. And for you, that was a change within Red Hat. Whereas my job at Red Hat started out remotely.
Yeah. Which I think is even more challenging. So in fact, that's a great, well, maybe we may never get to this article. We'll see. But no, I think that's a great jumping off point, because for people out there that are thinking, hey, I'd love to go remote, or how can I be successful as a remote-y? I am really amazed and impressed with how connected to the company you have become being remote, because I look back and I often tell people I don't think I could have been as successful as I have been if I hadn't spent those 2 years in a Red Hat office getting to know the people. And I still rely on some of those relationships that I developed, 10 plus years ago.
Right. I think that really is a key to being effective remotely, is you have to be willing to reach out to people, to contact them, and take advantage of opportunities to build relationships. I think depending on the job that you're doing, there are probably ways to succeed remotely where you have a job that is really entirely individually driven, right? You have a very, very clear set of tasks, and it's really about setting those things up and knocking them out. And as long as you're producing like that, that may count as success for some jobs. I think a lot of jobs, though, have a really complex web of relationships and tasks where you've really got to engage with other people and get input. You've got to consult with other stakeholders and really sort of leverage relationships that you have around an organization in order to get people onto a single plan and then get that plan executed. And I really think relationship building is a critical skill for that.
What would you say for yourself? Like, what were the keys to your success in doing that?
Well, I mean, such that I've had it. I think such as I've had it. I think for me, the key factors were when opportunities came up early in my career to travel somewhere where there were going to be key stakeholders, whether that might be my manager or peers or colleagues or people in other departments that were interesting to know because somehow their work sort of touched on mine, right? That might have been corporate communications folks or brand folks or even finance or other engineering managers, whoever they were, right? When I had an opportunity to see them face to face, I would take it. When I started at Red Hat in 2008, there wasn't really a well-developed culture of doing video conferencing at that time. I'm not sure exactly why. I think that was really sort of emergent at that point. And when it became easier to meet up with people one-on-one like that, I really jumped on that train pretty early and tried to take advantage of that as well, right? Because you can't always travel places. And that sort of gives the lie to being productive remotely. If the answer is you have to see people face to face, that would make it seem like you really can't be effective remotely. But of course, the answer is you can, because nowadays the tools are there really to do that. So when those things emerge, I really use those as a key for building rapport with people and sort of making connections and trying to understand where other people are coming from. And it's a lot easier to do that with a conversation where you can hear their voice or see their body language and sort of be able to read between the lines a little bit more. Mm-hmm. And then using that, you can build rapport. And I think when you do that, it makes it a lot easier to call on those people later.
Well, and I found too, simply meeting someone in person even one time make a huge difference.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the ways that we communicate remotely is, whether you're doing it through, Slack or, IRC or some other sort of messaging, is that you're sort of disconnected from the person's body language, from their voice. And when you don't know someone, it's very hard to read their conversational tone into printed words. And when you know somebody, even if it's casually, right, you've met them once, you've heard their voice, you've seen their face, you can kind of attach that to the messaging, and it becomes a lot easier to open up and be honest and forthright in your communication, and be able to also kind of attach a filter to what that person says, where if you didn't know them, right, they might say something that would strike you as a little odd or maybe even off-putting or or aggressive. But if you know that person, then you can sort of read that body language over the message. You can kind of overlay it.
Yes.
Yeah, and it sort of helps you attach good intentions to it, or at least you get a sense of that person's their whole being, and it makes it a lot easier to then have a good discourse, right? And it's kind of like, I don't know, it's kind of like lubrication, I guess. And you can apply that when you're face to face by experiencing it firsthand, but you can also kind of drag it out of your memory and apply that as an overlay to the text style messaging that they're giving you, and get, I don't know if it's the next best thing, but it definitely helps.
Right. Yeah, so definitely willingness to travel if you want to be successfully remote. I think that's key. Yeah, meeting in person when you can. Video. What other tricks have you found, or other techniques have you found that have worked really well?
So as far as tricks for being remote, I think for me, one of the things that I tend to like personally is a sense of consistency. So I'm usually in the same place when I'm working. I have an office downstairs in the basement, and I try and keep it relatively clutter free, right? I don't put a lot of things on a virtual desktop on my computer. It's a really blank screen, and often I have it covered with just one window, whether that's a web browser or a terminal where I'm, using a lot of communication tools or whatever. Having that lack of distraction on the computer is helpful for me. The consistency of having an office space in the house is really good for me. It's a psychological space that I use. So when I come here, it is going to work. And the funny thing is, my kids have kind of grown up with me doing this. I've got two teenagers now, 15 and 13. And for most of their lives, I've been working for Red Hat. And they understand this to be my office. So they treat it like one. So they don't usually come bursting in, partway through the day, things like that.
Right.
I mean, it helps to have those ground rules, but it's also that consistency of getting up in the morning and just psychologically knowing I'm going to the office. And the fact that the office is, a flight of stairs away doesn't change the fact that, when I go there, I attach significance to that. So having that space, I think, is important. But at the same time, I think this is really important, every once in a while, hang on just a second, sorry, you may have to clip this. But at the same time, another thing that I think is important is sort of shaking up that consistency too, right? I'll find that, whereas normally that consistency helps me, at times I can get in a little bit of a rut. And for me, shaking up the location sometimes gives me what I need, right?
How often?
It's not that often. I'd say maybe once a month.
Really? That's it?
So that's usually enough for me, honestly.
Oh my gosh.
About once a month.
I've got to go. Well, I recently got a co-working space 3 or 4 months ago, and I find like half a day. It used to be every day or two, but yeah, that's interesting. So you can go that long. That may show that I'm just a creature of habit or something a lot more. I think it's going to differ by person, right? Absolutely.
But I would say the first thing that I would do if I'm a remote-y, and maybe this is I don't know if you count this as advice or maybe just a challenge or something to the listeners. If you're in a space where you're feeling bored, or I don't know, a little bit negative, or you're feeling like you're kind of stuck mentally, the first thing I would do is leave your office, like find another place to work and see if that helps you. I mean, you have to kind of experiment to find out what works. Like some people have to have a quiet environment. Some people find it easier to be in a noisy environment. I'm actually strangely the latter type. If I go to a place where it's quiet, like a library, I find it really hard to concentrate because every little thing
it's too quiet.
Perks up my attention. But if I go to a coffee shop or or something like that, it's a lot easier to tune things out. Like I start really ignoring things that are around me because everything's just a sort of a hubbub or a bustle and it just kind of goes away. But again, I think that's a personal thing, right? You have to experiment and see what works for you.
It totally is. In fact, the changing of geography, I've even found I have a tiny office. It's like 10 by 10. And I have a desk with a chair in front of it. And then I have a rocking chair that kind of sits in the corner. I find even changing from my desk chair to my rocking chair can shake things up enough that can keep me going.
Yeah, I remember you mentioning that rocking chair in one of the other episodes. And if there are listeners out there who haven't heard, I'm trying not to be too much of a
too much of a fanboy.
This is not planned. I promise you guys in advance. But yeah, there's another episode where I think you talked about kind of feeling like you were stuck and getting a rocking chair and kind of cracking open a book for for half an hour or something. Really
I think
helped.
that was what do you want? What do you want, or what are you looking for? Yeah, I'll link to that when I figure it out.
Hey, we could, and the funny thing is we can tie this, I think, to one of the misconceptions about working remotely, because people talk about like the lack of productivity that they fear from remote workers. And if I say to somebody, like if you and I were to approach some, random manager who was not inclined to really favor remote work, and we were to say something like, "Oh yeah, go sit in a rocking chair and crack open a book for half an hour," they're going to look at that. They're going to think, "Oh my gosh," they're going to that person's just like shirking work for a half an hour. And I guess what I would say to that person is, how many times a day do you think you have workers in the office who, when they're walking by someone else's cube or someone else's office, or going down to the coffee shop, that they stop for 20 or 30 minutes and they end up having a conversation with a coworker, or meeting somebody that an acquaintance that they hadn't run into in a while, or something like that water cooler talk that happens. I mean, if you think that is also a loss of productivity, I would say no, it's really not. I mean, you trade that time for morale building. And for some people, when you're a remote worker, sometimes you can get that kind of boost from like a moment of quiet.
Right. Or you get it in a different way. And some of this, I think, is personality specific too. I mean, when I was in this particular Red Hat office, it wasn't unusual though. If I was trying to get something done, I would go hide out. Right. In fact, this is one of my tips for success is at the time.
Find a hiding place.
I did. I absolutely did. At the time, there were these empty offices with doors. And there was this whole row of them at the far end of the office. And I would go hide out in there. There was a phone in there, so I could make calls from it. Like I could make private calls from there. And so, yeah, there were a couple of them. I can still picture it. I can still remember going. In fact, one of them, I remember I had hidden out there for like 2 or 3 hours, and someone found me, and they're like, "This is where you were. We couldn't find you."
So you had to find a new one after that.
Yeah, I was like, yeah, that was exactly the point. You couldn't find me, so I get stuff done. So yeah, right. Oh, empty offices with a door, or even conference rooms. Oh yeah, I camped out in any number of conference rooms because for me, that quiet and that ability to focus and concentrate is really important. Whereas if someone's having a conversation right next to me, I find it really distracting. I just can't. And I don't. Sometimes I listen to music, but then I find that the music, for me, it's just quiet with a little bit going on. But yeah, it's. I think it is very person specific.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned sound. Actually, we both mentioned sound, I guess, and that's something that as we said, it's an individual preference. I can definitely judge for myself that the type of sound matters, right? Like if I'm in a noisy, bustly environment where I can't really pick out a lot of one specific conversation, I find that really helpful, right? It's kind of like white noise. Listening to music, I often do that at home, but there's a fine line, right? If I listen to music that I know well and that I really like, especially when it has words, the human voice or that human singing, like I'll start to pay maybe a little too much attention to it, or sing along, and that takes a little, it takes a little bit of your attention away from what you're doing. Whereas if I listen to something that's instrumental, that helps a lot, especially if it's things like, soundscapes, or if it's something that is, I don't know, like electronic music or electronic dance music or something like that, where there's, there may be a beat or a pulse to it, which makes you feel energized, but not really that sense of, lyrics or something deep that you have to pay attention to and get something out of.
No, and that reminds me of an episode that I did that I did it, oh my goodness, back in July, that I haven't done anything with. So I was camping along the Umpqua River in Southern Oregon, and I have a field recorder, and I did some recordings of the water. And it makes the perfect sound masking. It's not white noise, but it's like, I don't know how to describe it. So it's kind of, I guess you call it ambient noise. So I have an episode that's kind of done that I need to clean up and publish, but I was also going to share like these 30-minute segments that I made, that if people wanted to download them, they could use them to just kind of block out distractions. So this will be my motivation to get those going.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So, I mean, was this more like babbling brook noise?
Well,
or was this
it was
like
more,
waterfall?
it was something between, it was river / like very minor rapids. And so it had kind of a, I tried bubbling brook, and that at another place we went camping, and that did not work at all. It was too chill.
Gentle.
Yeah, it was too chill. But this one I did. I let the recorder go for, I don't know, 30 or 40 minutes, and there's birds in the background and different things. And then I did some smaller clips, and I need to take those clips and loop them in a way that you can't tell because I did them from different locations. I did them I waded into the water. I just kind of had fun with it.
If I didn't think that there were a lot of these already, I would say you have a product line.
Yeah.
Jane.
There are definitely plenty of them.
Maybe, I don't know, maybe if I don't know, maybe there's some way you could like, I don't know, you could somehow work artisanal into it.
Right. So here's a fun one. So flipping through the 10 myths, the 10th myth here is that Netflix is streaming all day.
Oh my gosh.
So have you ever watched Netflix during the workday?
No, I have not. Have you? Really?
Oh yeah. It gets back to the whole thing. If you're stuck and you're thrashing, like, watch something for 30 minutes. Why not?
Yeah. Well, it is that idea of taking.
I don't have it running in the back. Just to be clear, I don't have it like running on a monitor in the background. Now that would drive me crazy.
You're in the middle of a meeting and suddenly, like,
someone dies on
Jessica Jones like karate chops somebody or something. And they're like, John, are you okay?
Like, oh, I didn't see that coming. Yeah.
Oh my God. Yeah. Right in the middle of a meeting. There's a surprise twist. Yeah. No, I really haven't done that. Although I would say, when I think if I reach like a mental stopping point, like a brick wall, or, sometimes it's a little reward. Like if I finish an hour and a half worth of something that's really deep thought and writing, I might take, 10 or 15 minutes, and I might, check my feeds. I might look at like a quick YouTube video or something like that, just to, sort of break myself out of that loop. As far as something like really watching TV, or something where it gets me really, really far away from the office, I usually don't do that. Now I don't have a TV in here. I mean, I guess I could probably nowadays bring up Chrome and watch Netflix on that, but I haven't done it. I think for me, that's kind of a line that I personally don't like to cross. But I think partly that's because when I started as a remote-y, I was also starting at Red Hat. It was my first job in private industry, my first job, and I was starting as a remote associate, and I didn't know what my performance was going to be like. It was a brand new world for me, and I think I was petrified that I might turn into one of those people who, I don't know, ends up sitting on the couch and saying, "Oh, I'll just turn on, the news or Oprah or Judge Judy or whatever, and I can keep working. And then eventually I'd be sitting there with a bowl of popcorn by my side. And then eventually I'd be like, oh, I'll put the computer aside for a minute. And then eventually I'd have a beer, and it would just like be this slippery slope down into, it would end in like unemployment.
Your family's living in a van down by the river.
Drug addiction. Yeah, it would just be, it would end really badly. Like I constructed this entire myth of like what was going to happen if I watched, TV in the middle of the day or something like that. So I've stayed away from it for that reason, mainly, I think.
All right. Well,
but that's just my part. I tend to think that a lot of people don't really do that, other than, to break up the monotony. And I would say if you're going to do that, really the key is just to be accountable to yourself about what that time means. And if you're making it up in other ways and on a slightly different schedule, then I would call that perfectly valid, right? You can always measure it by the result.
Are you getting the job done?
Right. Yeah, it's not about whether you sit at a chair in front of a screen for 8.5 or 10 hours straight every day, day in and day out. It's about, what the results are. And, again, I think one of the biggest misconceptions about remote work is that somehow people who do it are really being lackadaisical, and they're just going to use that time to, just follow other pursuits or whatever the case may be. And I tend to find, at least the people I know, and, granted, that may be a biased sample, but the people that I know tend to treat it as a benefit, that it gives them the flexibility they need. So, in the middle of the day, they can walk away from their desk for, let's say, an hour and a half for a doctor's appointment, or, they need to pick up something at the grocery that's going to take, 35 or 40 minutes, and their spouse can't, or their loved one can't do it for whatever reason. And that's going to make their home life happier. And they're going to come back and they're going to make those minutes or those hours up doing what they do. And again, to me, there's always this background noise that you have at an office full of people where your schedule is so much less predictable. I mean, you hid from people to be able to get things done,
right?
Which just seems crazy, right? You go to an office that it's designed for you to get work done, right? The whole point is for you to be there and work, and yet you can't get your work done there, right?
Well, and I think that's a current conundrum that I've heard of and witnessed in some places, which is you've got an office for all these people to gather, and yet more and more people are working from other places.
Yeah, absolutely. So it is an interesting puzzle, like how you make office and remote work, compatible but distinguishable, right? Mm-hmm. Because I really think they're two different things, but you can get great results from both of them. Like, I'm not opposed to working in an office, and at times I've kind of felt like, man, sometimes I really would like to be in an office. The water cooler that I talked about earlier is an example. I mean, it's nice to be interrupted sometimes. It's nice to see other people's faces, and I every once in a while, I'll get a feeling that, gosh, it'll be nice to talk to so-and-so. But the great thing is today, there's no barrier to that. Just because I'm not in the physical office, I'll send that person an email or pick up the phone, give them a call, or even just, schedule something where, get on their calendar and say, hey, let's have a video call just, for 30 minutes. Let's just say hi and let's see how things are going. And I'll tell you, when I get those calls, I know that I'm one of the people who, on the spectrum, I'm, definitely kind of a connector type person where I really like having that type of relationship with people. So after I get done with one of those calls, I feel really great. I mean, that really gets me charged up, and I can go back to work and do whatever it was I was engaged in. And it just, I don't know, it makes me really happy for the rest of the day.
And I think with those calls, you can sneak those in sometimes too. So I've been in situations where I had like it was like a 3-minute question that I had for someone that probably could have been taken care of in an email, but instead I flipped it into a phone call or a video call. Yeah. And then, which was a nice segue just to have some FaceTime, some real-time conversation with that person. And I kind of use that little thing as an excuse for needing to talk to them in real time. And that is a really natural way, I think, to build relationships with people. So, which is kind of the opposite of a lot of stuff, which is like, well, don't interrupt someone by having a phone call with them. I mean, just send them an email and get it done with. But I think in the context of being remote, there is a place and there is value in, I don't want to say forcing, but, using excuses to have real-time conversation, because it's a little awkward to be like, hey, I need to have a real-time conversation with you.
Right. And, and sometimes those conversations might not be just an excuse, but sometimes it's a way to sort of, I don't know, tap people for subtle information. I don't mean being sneaky. I'm not talking about like trying to sneak information out of people or
being manipulative. No.
Right. No. Yeah. I'm not talking about that, but more like, let the conversation drift a little bit if people are willing and able to do that for a few minutes. And, you can find out a little bit about, things that they've heard or experienced recently that might be apparent if you were in the office, but wouldn't be otherwise. And you can kind of pick up on that. And sometimes that background or context, I mean, I've found out things like that randomly from people during a short call or a video conference or something like that. It was just of huge value. And I could take that to, some other conversation that I was having and really be, not just feel, but really be dialed in to things that are going on around the office. And, again, I think that helps bolster relationships. It helps bolster the feeling that you're part of the team, even if you're not there in body all the time.
Absolutely. So any other distractions that are jumping out, or not distractions, any other myths? So the myths here, I'll just read them off real quick. Remote work means productivity decreases. I think we covered that pretty well. I'd say it's potentially increases, or it can be the same. Remote workers are out of contact. Nope, we just talked about that. Remote work means your data is unsafe.
We didn't really go into data security, but that's boring.
It seems kind of...
And nowadays, I would say it's like, that's just so clearly out of step.
Communication suffers. Nope. Not if you're intentional about it. I think you have to be intentional. If you're just thinking that people are going to call you and do that, communication is going to suffer. But I think if you're proactive and you look for opportunities to maybe over-communicate, I think that can be really productive. Myth number 5, meetings are ineffective. Well, we've already talked about meetings last time. And yes, I do not. I think, I guess I qualify this one. I think depending on what kind of meeting you need to have. If you're having like a new team kickoff, meeting in person is going to have some benefits. Mm-hmm. If it's just a regular, project meeting, whatever, I think that you can kind of get into a rhythm where those are just as effective as if you have them in person.
Yeah,
and I've been doing it for the last 10 years, and so have you. Remote workers are lonely. Myth number 6. I don't get lonely. It sounds like, again, you got to be intentional and proactive on this one too.
Yeah, you have to and kind of be aware of your own feelings, right? I think largely, I know largely I am not lonely. I think every once in a while I do like connecting up with people, but that's an easy problem to solve, right? And it just starts with me, again, picking up the phone or getting in contact with somebody. I think I think that this is an important point for managers to be aware of, that they don't allow their remote people to be lonely, that it's a manager's job to make sure that people on your team who aren't with other folks feel like they're part of the team. And again, it's a solvable problem. And it really, it depends on the person. It depends on their work style, and it depends on what they're doing.
I would totally agree with you in terms of, in this one in particular, like consistent one-on-ones. So
Absolutely.
I guess I was thinking, well, if you had to choose between someone in an office and someone remote, I would just say if you're a manager, you need to have consistent one-on-ones with your people no matter where they are. But I think it's particularly critical for people that are remote.
Yeah. You can't forget about them.
Myth number 8, company culture suffers. Now, this is an interesting one because Red Hat has such a culture of distributedness and remoteness that I have a hard time seeing how this has happened at Red Hat, that the company culture has suffered. I don't think that it has at all.
Yeah, I don't feel that it has either. Not at least not from remote folks. I feel like we've had so many of them for so long. Something like, I don't know, isn't it like we still have about a quarter or a third of
I don't know the numbers on that. But I mean, the funny part about this is, so sometimes people have said, well, I mean, so which office is the product that you work on headquartered in? I was like, well, no office. In other words, the funny thing about this is, like, the products that I work on, there's no possible way to be in a central office. I mean, there are people spread out. I'm trying to think of, say, one of the products I'm working on. Off the top of my head, I would say people are spread out between 6 to 10 different locations. Yeah. And that only includes 2 offices. So, yeah. But I would say, on the other hand, I would say for new teams, building a culture can definitely take time, and can, maybe if you're bringing together a new group of people, this is where I think the importance of meeting and face-to-face periodically would be important.
Right. And I think that what you're saying here, the periodic touch point, I mean, certainly an initial, but also a periodic get together for people on a team, I think that can be really helpful for a lot of different reasons. But, one of them is, again, sort of building that bond between the team that requires, a physical presence. It's what humans are engineered for, that we respond to each other in ways that don't transmit over internet lines, essentially. So doing that once in a while, I think, is really important.
Right.
But the idea that you can, the idea that you could build a culture without ever seeing somebody, I'm not convinced that that's possible. Maybe in a minimal way, but I don't think in a way that's truly lasting and transformative.
Mm-hmm. Myth number 9, workers are working 24/7. Remote workers are working 24/7.
Yes. Even when I'm on stage playing, I'm thinking about work right then.
Well, yeah. I mean, their point, I guess, here is that remote people keep regular office hours. Yeah. This one, I would say, can be challenging depending on, like, I like the way you kind of described going down to your office as kind of heading to work. Sometimes I have thought of, like, having a ritual of walking around the block first, or having a more kind of definitive begin and end to the day, because I find it's easy to kind of we eat dinner fairly early, at 5:30, so it's really easy to have dinner at 5:30, and by 6:30 think, oh, I'll just go check on a few things and wrap a few things up, and then I've, without even thinking about it, another hour and a half or 2 hours has gone, and it's like, well, gosh, there goes most of my evening. So I don't know, I guess. But again, in today's day and age where everyone's connected all the time, and even if there is an office, I mean, the sense I get for people that are in offices these days is a lot of people are coming in late to the office, whatever late is, to miss traffic. And then they're leaving early to miss traffic again, or they're staying late. So I don't think there's anything special here about being remote.
Yeah, I don't think there is either. I think with the exception that in what I've sometimes seen at Red Hat, and I'll bet this is probably the case with other jobs that have a high proportion of engineers. I see a lot of folks who, for whatever reason around Red Hat, they're passionate about their job, but they're also, it's not just a vocation, it's also an avocation. And for some people, their work is their work, and their work is their hobby too, and their work is their life. I've seen that happen, and I know a couple people, and I won't name any names, obviously, but I know a couple people that they exhibit what I think of as kind of an unhealthy devotion to like one kind of work, and that really is the kind of stuff that they're being paid for, and they're doing it all the time, right? They're doing it during working hours. When work gets done, they eat dinner, they come back, and they're working again, and they're basically doing the same stuff all day and all night, other than when they're sleeping or eating. And I think that's a dangerous road to be on. I know that it was not helpful for me when I was early in my Red Hat career. I was worried about the accountability that I needed to show for a lot of people. I felt like I had to prove my results to a lot of people, regardless of what they were expecting, right? I don't think this really jived with reality. That was the problem, right? My reality filter was way out of whack. And I thought that I needed to be everywhere for everybody all the time. And so I was working, 15, 16-hour days every single day. And I did that for about a year and a half or so when I started at Red Hat. And, it really took a toll until, I think you and I had started to have a lot of talks around that time about effectiveness. And I kind of realized I was headed for a cliff, and really sort of changed my attitude that it needed to not be about quantity. It needed to be about quality.
Mm-hmm. And that's sometimes that's a fine balance too.
There are going to be different situations for different kinds of jobs. So it's absolutely the case that there are some jobs out there that require responsiveness around the clock, or, they're like, for example, some of the folks on my team manage an infrastructure, right? They're system administrators, and things sometimes break in the middle of the night without warning. Like, I don't know, a hard drive in a server goes bad or something like that. And that affects the service that's being used around the world. And so somebody is awake, probably trying to use it. And so, they spring into action and try and fix it. So there are jobs out there that require that kind of responsiveness, but that's not the same necessarily as working all the time. And for those folks, I'm always really upfront with them as a manager about, taking downtime. And, if somebody had to wake up in the middle of the night and fix something for a couple hours, they know that they have my full support. Either they're not going to be in first
come
thing
in late
morning,
or skip,
or skip out early tomorrow, or whatever the case may be, whatever works for them. But I do try and keep a tab on whether somebody is doing that and then also not trading it off for anything, right? Because I kind of think that's unhealthy, right? The thing that I tell them is that as much as I love working for Red Hat, and I really do, and I know there are people out there in your audience who love the companies that they work for, the thing to remember is that your company is never going to love you back. The company is not, it's not capable. It's a corporation. It cannot love you. It doesn't mean it's evil. I truly believe that there are companies out there that are doing great things, but it is incapable of love, right? The only thing that's capable of love are like, your friends, your family, your other loved ones, other humans. So the thing that we extract from the company in place of love are benefits, right? Our salary, our days off, our time off, things like that. And for a remote person, I think one of the benefits that we extract is flexibility. So if you're going to be responsible around the clock for something, then the way that the company can show you its own kind of broken equivalent of love is by showing you flexibility and saying, you know what, you're doing a great job. You fix this thing in the middle of the night for a couple hours. Don't show up till lunchtime, or, knock off early, on Friday and go see a movie or something like that.
No, I think that's really good. And it reminds me of actually, I think this might be a good title for the episode. Your company is incapable of love. But no, it reminds me of a similar thing. So The first job I had in my career was I was an auditor, an internal auditor at a big bank in Los Angeles. And I think I was into like my first year, and I was really stressed out about this particular audit that we had done. And I remember I was getting my review from the guy that had been leading this audit, and he really kind of gave it to me straight in a way that I've never forgotten. And he basically his point to me was lighten up. And then his exact words were, a year from now, everything we just did, it's not going to matter. I was like, what do you mean? It's like, think about it. We're gonna come back to this department a year from now. We're gonna do another audit. So the audit that we just did, it's irrelevant. It doesn't matter. And I've kind of taken that into other parts of my life, and even in company life sometimes, of thinking, okay, I'm really frustrated with how this process is working, or that this release is late. A year from now, is this really going to matter?
It's a question of aperture, right?
Yeah,
and over the next week, or it might be critical, and over the next month it may be important, but 2 years from now.
Yeah, and I'm not saying just phone it in because a year from now it's not going to matter. I'm just saying it's a matter of perspective and lasting impact, and yeah.
Right. There's a point where you really want to have that drive, and then at another point you also have to prioritize this against things like your health, your availability for your family, your ability to be a good human being, and those things all. And I think in that mix somewhere is the ability to be a largely productive member of your team or your organization.
And you can't do that. Yeah, and you can't do that if you're going all out all the time.
Right. Eventually you'll basically destroy yourself, and in doing that you cost a lot of the value that you're trying to build up.
Yeah, you're not helping anyone at that point.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks for listening to The John Polster Show. Notes, links, and all that other good stuff for this episode are at johnpolster.com/podcast. If you have questions or ideas around the podcast, send those to podcast@johnpolster.com.